buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a esta nueva conferencia de Casa Asia. Teníamos un poco de miedo porque con el calor que está haciendo no sabíamos si nos derretiríamos en el intento de llegar o echaría para atrás a la gente, pero bueno, estamos muy contentos de ver que todavía sigue despertando interés Afganistán y evidentemente con las dos personas que nos acompañan hoy en esta mesa, pues todos aquellos que estáis interesados, pues sabéis que son referentes. Así que nada, muy brevemente comentaros que esta presentación está en el marco de la edición en la nueva edición del libro Talibán de Ahmed Rashid en castellano, y habíamos pensado en hacer esta mesa redonda, ¿no? 10 meses después de la llegada de los talibán a Kabul, de la salida inesperada de las tropas occidentales. No sé qué fue más inesperado, si la llegada de los talibán o la salida de los occidentales, que nos sorprendió a todos. Y en Casa Asia pensamos que es muy pertinente seguir informando y seguir sabiendo qué es lo que está pasando allí, ¿no? El drama que siguen viviendo. Y sobre todo, bueno, a ver si nos dan unas claves de por dónde pueden ir un poco estos derroteros y seguir denunciando sobre todo la situación que viven, pues, en especial las mujeres y las niñas. Para ello contamos con Pilar Requena, en primer lugar, que le agradezco enormemente que haya venido a este diálogo con Ahmed Rashid, porque viene directamente de Televisión Española, porque está preparando el programa para mañana de Documentos TV, o sea que ha venido realmente, ha salido a toda velocidad. Muy brevemente voy a presentar a Pilar. Pilar también es autora de un libro sobre Afganistán que ya presentamos en Casa Asia en Barcelona hace unos cuantos años, periodista de Radio Televisión Española, presidenta de la Red de Periodismo de Investigación de las Televisiones Públicas Europeas, directora, como acabo de decir, de Documentos TV, que podréis ver mañana. Tiene numerosos premios. El último, ¿cuánto le han dado? Hace nada, ¿no? El viernes, con el Honest Mediterránea, se pronuncia así, que es valencià, el Honest Mediterránea, en reconocimiento a su larga carrera profesional en el periodismo internacional, trabajando para ofrecer una información independiente y crítica y visibilizando conflictos y realidades, algo que necesitamos cada vez más, ¿no? Quizá menos tertulianos y más periodistas realmente que conocen la realidad de lo que hablan. Ha sido corresponsal de Televisión Española en Berlín, en fin, tiene diferentes premios: Premio Internacional de Periodismo Rey de España, Europeo Civis, Premio Salvador de Madariaga. Podría estar aquí pues toda la tarde hablando de ella y de todo lo que conoce de Afganistán, pero tenemos al otro gran invitado, que es Ahmed Rashid, que lo va a presentar Pilar, y que fue Premio Casa Asia en el 2004, 2005, my memory is not functioning correctly, 2007, es el calor, los problemas, the problems with my memory is because it's so hot.
When was the award Casa Asia? 2007, no?
2007.
Yeah, because I met him the first time 26, and 27 when she got the award we were already friends.
Because the first time Ahmed came to Casa Asia was in 2003 for the Universal Cultural Forum of Cultures in Barcelona. It was the first time we met in Barcelona, and we fortunately we continue with this relation. Well, I'm sorry, I'm changing to English because now the dialogue will be in English with Ahmed, between Pilar and Ahmed. So I stop here, I give you the floor, and once again, Pilar, thank you for coming, rushing from the TV to Casa Asia, and thank you, Ahmed, for accepting this invitation. So, Pilar.
Okay, thank you, Rafa, for inviting me, and also it's a pleasure and an honor to have a dialogue with Ahmed Rashid, a good friend. I mean, it's not someone who is strange to me. I think you already know who is Ahmed Rashid, but nevertheless, I will tell some short biography, of the long biography he has already. Ahmed Rashid is a Pakistani-British journalist and a best-selling author of several books about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. For decades, he was the correspondent of the Daily Telegraph and the Far Eastern Economic Review, and now he regularly appears as analyst and an expert in BBC, CNN, and is being interviewed, you can imagine, by lots of media around the world. He also writes for the Wall Street Journal, The Nation, Daily Times of Pakistan, and also for academic journals. He is also serving on the boards of the International Crisis Group, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Internews, and his work as an advisor to the international community of the Red Cross. He has received a lot of awards and is considered as one of the most renowned authorities in the region. He has also been sought for advice by international leaders, diplomats, or policymakers. His most well-known book is The Taliban. Now we have a new version in Spanish. The Taliban has been translated into more than 20 languages and became a bestseller after 9/11 because it was the only book on the international market on the Taliban, and everyone wanted to read it in the moment where 9/11 occurred, and nobody knew anything about the Taliban. Our dialogue today is also to present, as Rafa has said, a new edition of this book. But if you want to know anything and details about the region, about Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, don't forget also to read The Jihad, the Rise of Militant Islam in Central Asia, Descent into Chaos, or Pakistan on the Brink. All of them are the best books, probably, on this issue that you will find in the international market. And I am not saying it because I am his friend. I'm saying it because before being his friend, I was a journalist interviewing him. And he was already an authority that all journalists in the world wanted to have face-to-face and know him. At the end, I have to say that he's a good human being, always ready to help you, always ready to open you the door of the places he knows very well. And for me, it has been a big help when I introduced myself in Afghanistan a couple of decades ago. We have organized it like he will make an introduction of 10-15 minutes, and after we will go into a dialogue where you can imagine the principal person will be him, not me, because he's, so to say, my teacher, the one whom I always look into. And for me, it's also quite difficult to dialogue with him because I don't want him to say, you are not right in this. But we will try to dialogue, but letting him to be the lead of all the dialogue. Yours is the floor.
Thank you very much, Rafael, Pilar, and thank you for the introduction. It's very kind of you. I'm just going to speak briefly. I wish that my book, this Taliban book you see here, has been republished with a new introduction given the capture of Kabul by the Taliban last year. I mean, quite frankly, I wish this book, it was good enough with the description that it has of the first Taliban capture of Kabul in 1996. I didn't want to repeat the history of the Taliban once again, but sadly for the Afghan people, for the region, for all the countries around Afghanistan, we have had to repeat this, not just the history, but also the book itself had to be brought up to date with what was going on. The Taliban return to power, I think, has been hugely detrimental to Afghanistan, the people of the country, and the region. All the neighboring countries are extremely affected by the revival of the Taliban, and frankly the failure of the American intervention of 20 years long. The American intervention in Afghanistan did bring a lot of benefits to the Afghan people, but it was unable to secure a political settlement amongst the Afghans. And that was a crucial loss of the American effort. I think one of the things that President Putin noticed about the American failure, he thought this was a very good opportunity to see American failure in Afghanistan, that the Americans will not intervene in Ukraine if I go into Ukraine. I think it's had a huge impact on Russia, because remember, the Russians were beaten in Afghanistan in 1989, and they were forced out, but they left in a very militaristic and secure way. It was not a chaotic withdrawal like what we saw of the Americans. Afghanistan is now beset with a humanitarian crisis, a political crisis, an economic crisis, and not to speak of the restrictions that have now been put on social welfare, on women, on education. What we have seen is basically a return to the Taliban of the 90s. I think a lot of people thought that the Taliban would learn their lesson and they would not behave as they did in 20 years ago, but unfortunately they have. And the problem I think that most people don't understand is that the Taliban is an ideological Islamic movement. It is doing this because it believes that in the way that they treat women, and the way they are treating education, the way they have locked out women from the social sector, that this is part of an ideology. And this ideology, even they spent 20 years in exile in Pakistan and Iran. This ideology has not been shaken at all. And that has been one of the catastrophes. And unfortunately, the neighboring states, including my own country, Pakistan, and Iran, and even China to some extent, they have all sustained the Taliban in exile with these extremist views. Nobody has tried to change the Taliban. Now we have a massive humanitarian crisis and a huge outflow of refugees. And I think it has to be said that the Afghans feel that the way the refugees from Ukraine have been dealt with has been a much more positive and productive way than the way that Afghan refugees are facing now. They're being blocked in Pakistan, they're being blocked in Iran. There's certainly a lot of them, unless they have visas, are being blocked in the West, in Europe, and we still have thousands of Afghans who fought for the regime, whose lives are now in danger and are facing a terrible situation, hiding inside the country, trying to get out of Afghanistan. And it's very disheartening to see this. The other question is, I think the other major question is the question of extremism. The fact is that the Taliban have been backed by all the major extremist and terrorist groups in the region, which includes Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, the Uyghur movement against Chinese oppression. All these movements have had a base in Afghanistan, and they have all been very deeply involved in helping the Taliban come to victory. Without these groups helping the Taliban, I don't think the Taliban would have found a victory in Afghanistan and defeated the Americans. And the fact is that at the Doha meeting, at the Doha conference, which finally settled the details of the American withdrawal, it was agreed that the Taliban would not allow foreign terrorist groups on their soil. And what we have seen in the last 9 months since the Taliban came to power is that they have not really done anything about anyone. All these groups are still active, and for example, the Pakistani groups are now attacking the Pakistan, and Sunni Iranian groups are attacking in Iran. So the Taliban have not fulfilled even the basic demand of the Americans and the West, which was to deal with these terrorist groups. The economic situation is absolutely dire. There's a food crisis internationally now, and that's going to affect Afghanistan because Afghanistan has not produced any harvest either last year and probably a very small harvest this year. The only thing that is in production is opium, and that is proving to be, even though the Taliban have announced that they will shut down opium production, nobody knows how they intend to deal with the farmers who rely on opium. So, what can be done? Well, the first thing is that if you have all this, what can be done when there is absolutely no serious diplomacy going on to try and get the Taliban to be more understanding? And that, I think, is the biggest strategy. We are seeing the same thing in Ukraine. There is no major diplomatic initiative by the Americans, by the EU, by NATO, or by any of the multinational organizations. And Afghanistan especially, people like myself and others have been asking for many months and years to appoint a high-level diplomat who would be acknowledged by the Taliban for his experience and know-how, and to allow diplomacy to take root in the country. We're seeing even in Ukraine that I'm sure there are many European diplomats and officials who have had relations in the past with President Putin, yet nobody is actually addressing the issue in Moscow. And that, of course, is leading to even more destruction in Ukraine and is prolonging the war. So I think the first thing I would say is that we need diplomacy at the highest level. Secondly, the Taliban are very keen to rebuild the organs of state. They want to organize an army, they want to organize a government of their own, unfortunately, not of anybody else, but only of their own manpower. But they want to build institutions. And what the West can do to try and persuade the Taliban that these institutions, we can help you build these institutions if you agree to allow education, women's rights, etc. So so far there's a dead end there. But the other factor is that what we've seen since the Taliban came to power is actually a worsening of the situation for women. Women have been barred and banned from higher education, although up to class 6, girls can go to school, but after that they are barred. All women have been thrown out of all their jobs, whatever it was. There are now demands to wear the full burqa, the full veil, but the most devastating thing that is being felt by everyone is the lack of female education, and because that affects the whole growth of the nation, and it compares very badly with the way the women were benefiting from the previous regime before the Taliban, where there was a great deal of educational activity and women held some of the top jobs in the government and in the bureaucracy. So lastly, I will just talk about the region and just say that the region expected, that is China, Pakistan, Iran, Central Asia, they expected the Taliban to behave better. They didn't expect the Taliban to behave in the way that they are behaving, and sustaining these militant groups, many of them which come from the region. but we have not seen any change. I think the other crucial factor, which we can also discuss, are the differences within the Taliban. There is, the dialogue is being carried on at the moment by UN and NGOs with the Taliban government in Kabul. But the Taliban government in Kabul is not the Taliban ruling. The ruling faction is sitting in Kandahar. And they don't appear in public. They don't make public speeches or statements. They don't tell you, but they are the ones who are driving this anti-woman policy, anti-education policy. So I'm going to stop here, Pilar, and let you go ahead. Thank you.
You will have to go. You will have to go on speaking. Eh? Don't think that I will do the work for you. I mean, you have said, Emmet, one thing, that there were a lot of benefits in the American intervention, and I think we both agree on that. But you have also said, or at least I have understood it like that, that the Afghans themselves were not able to settle an agreement between themselves,
yeah.
And that maybe this was the reason for the failure at the end of the day. Was this the Afghan fault, or it was really because other powers from outside didn't let also the Afghans, the different Afghan factions, to settle an agreement, or it was also because the international community have let the warlords to control power in Afghanistan, also after the American invasion and intervention of the international community?
Well, you raise a lot of issues, but let me just briefly say that the fault is not just with the major fault lies with the Afghan leaders, the warlords, who were not able to come together and make any kind of peace, except a political process. They had elections, but those elections were fraudulent and were unfortunately a disaster, and they didn't stabilize the situation. Yes, the outside powers, the neighboring countries, all played a very negative role. They were supporting various different elements of the Taliban. Remember, this started in the 90s when the Taliban first emerged. They were being supported by Pakistan. Later, Iran came into the picture. Later, Central Asia and China came into the picture. And they all had a role in supporting some element of the Taliban, which made the politics of trying to achieve reconciliation very difficult. And finally, after the American occupation, invasion, whatever you want to call it, the fact is that the American political strategy was really missing completely. They tried to monopolize the whole political process, but it needed much more than that. It needed the support of the Europeans and all the Western organizations, and it needed an economic development. And there was very little of that. For example, drugs. I mean, drugs has been flourishing in Afghanistan, even with the pro-American regimes that were there. And people have not understood that as to how the Taliban were able to sustain their war and their war effort for 40 years through drug production. And drug production today, I mean, there's 250,000 hectares of land which has come under drug production. People don't grow wheat, they don't grow fruit, they don't grow any productive produce. They find it much more convenient to grow opium.
You have also spoken that we need diplomacy at the highest level. We don't see it in Ukraine. In Ukraine, we have a war. Here in Europe, how can we come to a diplomacy at the highest level in Afghanistan when it looks like the Western world and at all America, the United States, have forgotten Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I hope sessions like this could be repeated in other parts of the world. But for example, the woman issue in Afghanistan has appalled everyone in the world. I mean, it is far worse than what it was 20 years ago. There are restrictions, there beating up of women demonstrators. And the fact is that for the first time in Afghanistan, you have got now a civil society. You've got teachers, intellectuals, journalists, TV stars. You've got a civil society, which of course the Taliban are trying to destroy. And because the last thing they want is a civil society which is successful. So what we are seeing now is a worsening of the situation, which and the Taliban are doing their utmost to beat down civil society, of which women play a very important part.
Are you really surprised of what is going on? I mean, I don't think that you really believed in August, September, that about this Taliban 2.0, everyone wanted to sell us, saying that it was a new Taliban,
yeah.
that they were new Taliban, that they have changed, that there will be an inclusive government. It was really enjoyable to hear about it and thinking an inclusive government. It looks like what they have learned in reality was the propaganda of the West. It was very, very nice to hear inclusive government thinking here in the West that there will be women, and they will, in reality, I think they were meaning that they will be inclusive of all Taliban, but nothing more, exclusive of all the others. How could it be that although there were a lot of analysts and experts like you saying, hey, don't believe that the Taliban have really changed, that the people really believe through the media that were in some way, some of the media or a lot of the media whitewashing in reality the Taliban, this new Taliban. They wanted us to believe that things have changed, and now they are all surprised because the Taliban have put or have obliged now the women to put and to wear the burqa.
Well, again, I think the American-European presence in Afghanistan did a great deal to build a civil society, to build up education and good governance. But they also made a lot of mistakes. And those mistakes were a lack of a political agenda, a lack of a plan. And what we saw is the failure to really, in this period when the Americans were sitting in Kabul, the failure to really address the political crisis that there was in the country. And every American president who came in treated the Afghans differently. Biden, for example, has no time for Afghanistan. He's already declared it several times through his aides that he's fed up with Afghanistan. He has no time for it. Now, I think Obama was perhaps even the same. Obama did very little to understand the makeup of the political situation in Afghanistan. And surprisingly, the Republicans who were there to defeat communism in the early days actually were willing to learn about Afghanistan and to bring about policies that were more constructive, which is unusual. So I'm not happy about anything that frankly the Americans did, but we did have a production at the end of the day, which led to there were changes in Afghanistan over 20 years of the American occupation, and they were very positive. And unfortunately, the Taliban did not see the benefits that they could gain from the civil society that was emerging. The mullahs are against civil society completely. They don't believe in it. They think it is treacherous. It is anti-Islam. It is nothing to do with having an Afghan nation and an Afghan state.
But maybe this is also because of what you have said. You have described the Taliban as an ideological Islamic movement. In this sense, probably there is no way to find a place for the civil society.
Yeah. Well, I think there was the hope that the Taliban would have learned lessons from the past government that they ran. They ran a terrible government in the 90s when they captured Kabul in 96, only to be thrown out by the Americans in 2001. But the Taliban didn't learn any lessons, unfortunately, and I was very skeptical because I'd been watching. I was not watching what they were doing so much in exile, but I was certainly watching their statements and their what they were saying, and what they were talking about was exactly the same thing that they were talking about 20 years before, and that was the tragedy. They refused to learn. The leadership was very much the same. When I first met these leaders in Taliban in 92, 93, they were all teenagers. They were all very young. They were in their teenagers or in their 20s. And then they became, and when I saw them again after Kabul was conquered, these were the same people. Their children were now getting educated in Pakistan and Iran. Their women, their daughters were going to school and college in the neighboring countries. But they were refusing to allow the Afghan people to have education or anything else.
Coming to the current situation, it looks like that there are some fightings inside the Taliban, at all in the north part of Afghanistan. The resistance is also coming back, very small and step by step. Is there any possibility for the resistance to throw away the Taliban? What would they need, this resistance? Is it possible to create another North alliance, or it will be only the Tajiks and maybe the Hazaras?
Well, there is resistance, but it's a very small resistance. It's being led by Tajiks and Uzbeks from northern Afghanistan. But it's not a resistance that could overturn the present Taliban regime. Remember, the Taliban are not only got now 50, 60,000 men under arms, but they have all the weaponry that they captured from the Americans, which is a huge amount of transport, tanks, guns, everything. So, secondly, nobody wants to arm an anti-Taliban faction in Afghanistan, because they consider that if Iran does it, or Pakistan does it, or Central Asia, or China, or anybody else does it, this would be, the Taliban would turn against them and would allow terrorism to take place in these countries. So nobody wants to, we can't have a repeat of the 90s when all the neighboring countries were helping the Taliban in one way or the other. So there's a reluctance there. Secondly, I think what you said earlier, that Afghanistan is not on the agenda. People want to forget about Afghanistan. Maybe a few NGOs can be working there, and maybe some money can be delivered to them, but I don't think the West is serious about trying to help Afghanistan rebuild itself. And the destruction in the country, the moral destruction, I mean, it is not as severe as what the TV pictures we see of Ukraine and Kiev, but the moral destruction of Afghanistan in the last 9 months has been terrible. And it has led to not half the country, but a large part of the country fleeing and seeking shelter in other countries. This is exactly what the Russians have created in Ukraine. Except there they've destroyed city after city. Here the Taliban don't have that capacity, but it's an extremely dangerous thing. The one thing I will say is that I think it's very important that all the warlords who are trying to come back in an anti-Taliban front, they need to depend and generate more support for civil society. If the Taliban were faced with a mass movement of women, of students, of the people in the media, I think that needs to be, that is the first priority. Regime change in Afghanistan has always been done by warlords and through war. What is needed now is not just war, but also a mass movement to show to the Taliban that this form of governance that you're bringing into Afghanistan is not acceptable.
But how can they do this? I mean,
well, it's happening already. I mean, you're seeing, incredible pictures of women demonstrating in the streets of Kabul, women being beaten up, by the Taliban. I'm not saying this is the only way, but you have to have the involvement of the population. In the last time the Taliban were in power, they were able to govern because there was no opposition in the street. There was no social activity in the street which was resisting the Taliban. So you need civil society to be activated. And I think, for the first time, you're seeing that. Even though a lot of Afghans have left the country, you are seeing civil society being activated.
But I don't think this would be enough. I mean, I am really very proud of...
You will need a guerrilla war also. I mean, you will need a fighting also.
And how could it come to this guerrilla war and to this guerrilla resistance if there is no support from the West? I mean, and secondly, will really the Hazaras or the Tajiks or the Panshiris will really trust the West back after what they have done? That they have left alone.
Look, I don't think the Taliban government is sustainable. I don't think it can last. It's going to collapse of its own violation. It's not going to collapse because the Americans have come in or somebody else has arrived. It's going to collapse because of its own weaknesses and its refusal to accept the reality of modern day living and to refusal to accept what the Afghan people are desirous of. So I think, what we've seen so far, 9 months, there has been no effort to create a constitution or a system of government. What is your Taliban system of government? Nobody knows. They don't have one. They don't talk about one. So are they just going to continue like this without any election or any political activity or bringing people into the government, etc.? Secondly is the humanitarian crisis, which the Taliban are not going to be able to deal with and is very, very severe. Third is the activity of the warlords who are all sitting outside the country at the moment, but they could come back and there could be a leadership. But fourth, I think most encouraging is the fact of the activities of civil society.
Good, because I was really hopeless. Now I have got a bit of hope in the future. How is the situation, for example, between the Taliban and the terrorist groups? I mean, the ISIS, of Khorasan, and other terrorist groups, because it was said in September, in August and September, that probably there would be a lot of fighting between themselves for the power, etc., and that this could maybe erode the power of the Taliban. Is this also an issue, or they really are still supporting the Taliban, as you have said before, that without the need and without the support of all these extremist groups, the Taliban would not have got the
Well, all these extremist groups have given the Taliban their manpower. And even in the occupation of Kabul last year, we saw many of these groups join with the Taliban to enter into Kabul. And that's hugely detrimental, especially when they have promised the international community that they will not allow extremist groups to take part in any kind of activity against their neighboring countries. And what we are seeing is that these extremist groups are carrying out actions against the neighboring countries with or without Taliban permission. I think we should, if there's anybody...
What the moment. I will give it in 3 minutes. I will come to the questions of the audience. But I have still some questions that I want to put. Now you have collapsed me. No, Pakistan. How has it changed something about the influence and the interference of Pakistan in Afghanistan after the ousting of Imran Khan and the new coalition government in Pakistan? Do you expect some changes or not at all?
I think Pakistan had promised the international community before the fall of Kabul that they would influence the Taliban to become sensible and do the right thing and set up a proper government and all that. And unfortunately, I think Pakistan was unable to do that. Either unable or unwilling, we don't know, but it was not able. There was an attempt to bring China, Russia, Central Asia and Iran into an early recognition of the Taliban government. But it didn't happen, and Pakistan was not able to influence the outcome of the Taliban capture of Kabul. And so I think Pakistan has lost a lot of ground in that. Imran has emerged as this anti-American. I don't think he understands even what it means to be anti-American, but he is insisting that he's anti-American and pro-Taliban. He's given several statements encouraging the Taliban. And at the same time, don't forget that Pakistan is facing the Pakistani Taliban, who are attacking the Pakistan army, and yet you have Imran Khan who's saying Taliban are actually a good thing. So there's a lot of confusion in Pakistan at the moment, and there's an enormous political crisis. We don't know how it's going to be resolved. I fear that ultimately it will be the military that will come back in again. And at the moment, the government in power, which was the government in power, is unable to convince the country that they can rule properly. Imran is being sacked for the time being. There is no unity at all at the moment in Pakistan. It's a very troublesome fact, and the most important factor is, of course, that this is a nuclear power, and which is facing a crisis with India and now with America, and at the same time faces an economic crisis.
Okay, then we will go to the audience. Someone wants to put any question? Uno, dos. Okay, first. Aquí, ella fue la primera.
Por favor, hacer las preguntas lo más breve posible.
Good evening. First of all, let me congratulate you for this wonderful debate. Undoubtedly, although Afghanistan has suffered these extreme government change, it's obvious that we can't avoid Afghanistan, right? International community.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit or put the mic closer?
Yes. Do you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. So I was saying that although Afghanistan has suffered this extreme change of government, it's obvious that international community cannot avoid Afghanistan nowadays. So regarding to a future perspective, how do you think that international community or the world is going to deal with an Afghanistan under the Taliban power? Thank you.
Well, the simple answer is that they're not dealing with it. They're ignoring it, and that's where the tragedy is, that the Afghans helped defeat the Soviet Union. They set up their own government. They had elections. A lot of it was done with support from the US and the European countries. But what we've seen is a complete failure now to have any interest in Afghanistan. Now, you can understand that with Ukraine going on, but Afghanistan is a population of 40 million. They're saying 20 million people could die of starvation. So, I mean, for me, that's an indicator of the importance of Afghanistan and the neglect by the world.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is about the deal with the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. How optimistic are you with this deal with the government of Pakistan? And if you think that the Taliban are using these groups, not just them, but the other groups, in order to get leverage over the countries or the countries in the region?
Sorry, what is the last bit?
If they're using the groups like the Uzbek movement, Islamic movement, if they're using ISIS, if they're using the Tajik movement, in order to get some sort of leverage over the other countries in the neighborhood, the Taliban.
Well, you know, I mean, it was very simple for the Taliban. If they were willing to dump their terrorist partners, they should have done it, and that would have won them Western support. Now, for example, there's $7 billion worth of money belonging to Afghanistan, which has been banked in America. Now, Biden is not releasing that money until the Taliban behave and until the Taliban also get rid of these terrorist groups from their soil. Now, in my opinion, I think most Afghans would welcome that if the Taliban were to move out these groups and say, I'm sorry, we can't keep you here any longer. You get out, go somewhere else, you know. And the Taliban did not take up that opportunity. Instead, they are sticking to what, you know, remember they supported Osama bin Laden till the end, till the Taliban were destroyed, wiped out, and defeated. And they're doing the same thing again. They're supporting these terrorist groups until the end. And this was the one leverage that the Taliban had with the Americans and the West, that we will deal with these extremists. And this hasn't happened, unfortunately. And it just shows the lack of judgment, I mean, on their part, you know.
Yes, thank you very much for this debate. And I think that has been very interesting to hear you, Pilar and you, but you for me, because it's the first time that I have this opportunity, and the lack of political settlement. I think that Occident has never worked during these last 20 years the political issue in Afghanistan. So this is the result. But looking at the future, do you think that, and just understanding the big problem that Pakistan, your country, has actually, about the lack of union and the problem they have with the Pakistani Taliban from Afghanistan now, do you think that China, Pakistan could have a way to have some kind of solution for the future? I mean, solution means trying to stabilize the country and give more opportunity to the civil society that you said, and for me has been very interesting this point. Thank you.
Te he preguntado.
Perdón, que tiene que responder la pregunta anterior.
Hola.
Sorry, I forgot.
Which role can China play in this?
Yeah, well,
China
you know,
and Pakistan.
look, as I said, after the defeat when the Americans fled, I think there was the belief that these countries, the neighboring countries, led by Pakistan and China, would quickly recognize the Taliban and help the Taliban, and also moderate the Taliban. And this was the message they gave to the Americans and to the... but it never happened, because the Taliban never became moderate. They never... You couldn't recognize the Taliban if the Taliban were not going to recognize women, and they were not going to recognize girls in school. So the crisis became even worse. And what we're seeing now is, as I said, Pakistan's role has become much less than it was before. And China came in very quickly last year to help the peace process. China's walked out. They've walked away. And it's too dangerous, because Chinese diplomats are being killed, either in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. So the regional picture has become complicated and very negative. Nobody wants to step into the Taliban camp at the moment to try and explain to them. But that's what I say, there's a lack of diplomacy. And that is really very detrimental. We need diplomatic effort, whether it's the UN or anyone else.
¿Ya? Hablo en español, en inglés no sé. Bueno, te voy a preguntar tres preguntas muy sencillas. Una, ¿por qué los talibanes, tras la imposición de la ley islámica radical, qué perspectivas políticas tienen los talibanes ahora mismo como gobierno? Y la segunda pregunta es si la Liga Yorga lo respetan los talibanes, y por qué han fracasado los ingleses, los rusos, los americanos a no comprender históricamente o religiosamente el Afganistán, porque era una monarquía estable, que yo sepa, nada más.
La segunda no la he entendido. What are the political perspectives of the Taliban regime? But the second one?
Why the big powers failing in Afghanistan? The Soviet, the Americans, the British, all foreign powers failed in Afghanistan.
You mean all foreign powers?
Why they fail to understand?
No.
Why they fail to understand Afghanistan, so to say?
No, look, I mean, the Afghans from the earliest period, from Genghis Khan to, the British to after that, the Afghans have never been colonized. They have never been a colony of either Britain or Russia or any of these other countries. And that has given them a very strong identity and a very strong national pride in what they believe in. Afghanistan, I knew it as a very peaceful country. When you first went in the 60s and 70s in Afghanistan, it was a peaceful country, extremely poor, very poor, but a country that was at peace with itself. And what undermined and destroyed Afghanistan was foreign intervention, starting with the British, and then the Soviets, and then all the neighboring countries became involved also. So I think the influence of the foreign interventions, many foreign interventions, the Afghans could not face that, and they've been slowly destroyed because of that.
Bueno, más o menos lo que he venido a decir es que los afganos nunca han sido colonizados, nunca han sido colonia de nadie. Eso ha hecho que se forme una fuerte identidad y también orgullo en sí mismo. Fueron siempre un país pacífico, extremadamente pobre, eso sí, y que lo que ha provocado la destrucción de Afganistán a lo largo del último par de siglos ha sido realmente la intervención extranjera, que es la que ha provocado la violencia dentro del propio Afganistán. And the others, the political perspectives of the Taliban?
Well, we have no idea what the Taliban want. I mean, 9 months have passed and we still don't know. Do they want elections? Do they want a meeting of the elders? Do they want some kind of religious council made up of the mullahs? We have no idea what political system they want.
Ok, resumiendo, no tenemos ni idea de lo que quieren los talibanes después de 9 meses. No se sabe qué sistema de gobierno quieren, si quieren un consejo de una determinada manera o de otra. El problema es ese, que no se sabe cuáles son realmente las perspectivas políticas de los talibanes. Recordemos que Emmet ha dicho al principio que son realmente un movimiento ideológico islámico y por lo tanto creo que, como él dice, no es que no lo sepamos, es que no creo siquiera que hayan tenido nunca perspectivas políticas más allá de controlar el poder y mantener su ideología, imponer su ideología por encima de cualquier sistema político viable. Pero lo último ha sido mi añadido.
Yes, thank you for your words. In addition, I think you said that Taliban didn't learn a lesson. I think it's us who didn't learn a lesson, because Taliban took the control again easily, exactly in the same point, holding the position with the same policy. So year after year, over and over, they have a clear idea about what to do with Afghanistan to control the market of opium. And probably the only solution is a collapse of the whole system, taking control of different aspects of different lords of war. And in the meantime, the rest of the world say, what a pity with Afghanistan, poor country, to hell with Afghanistan. Is my opinion, from my point of view. It's a pity, but it's like this. I don't know if you think that the only solution will be inside for this process of collapse, and nobody cares about what the future about Afghanistan. Thank you.
You see, I mean, people couldn't believe this. I mean, what the earlier question about, I mean, didn't people understand that they hadn't changed? People were hoping, I mean, the public, Pakistan, the countries around Afghanistan, the international community, they said, how can you be living in exile for 40 years, educating your children in Pakistan and Iran, but refusing to allow any kind of change in Afghanistan? It doesn't make sense. And that's the tragedy, I think, that the leadership came, the leadership of the Taliban believed that if they became liberal in any way, allowed education, women to go to work, etc., this would distract the young fighters, the young soldiers, from going to war and fighting. And this belief that we have to keep our young soldiers pure of any influence, and the last thing that you can do with them is allow their wives to be educated. So I think it's a very, it's a very complex phenomenon, but you're right that essentially the Taliban were not prepared for change. They did not want any kind of change within their own community.
Thank you, Casa Asia, and thank you, Ahmed Rashid. This is a privilege to be listening to you after reading to you many times. And thank you, Pilar and Rafael. Two questions. Building on the question before about China and Pakistan, do you think China and Pakistan are going to regret their support to the Taliban? Just simple yes or no, or whatever is your opinion. And then the second question, you talked briefly before about reconciliation, which is something that no one usually speaks about within Afghanistan. There's been a civil conflict, or a civil war between Afghanistan, and obviously there is a lot of internal rivalry between different ethnicities, Pashtun and the other ones, mostly. And do you think actually that there is a need for, or is there any, not now, but in the future, this is something that we have to pay more attention about reconciliation between Pashtuns and the other ethnics, because somehow also the Taliban is a way for Pashtuns to keep controlling the rest of Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, briefly, China. The Chinese were very keen to come into Afghanistan and exploit the minerals and the very precious minerals, copper, coal, and they were banking on Pakistan supporting them and speaking to the Taliban and being the middleman for this exploitation of the minerals in Afghanistan. Now that never happened because the Taliban came back exactly as they were 20 years ago. So China's role for the time being is China has just walked out of the picture completely. And if this government if the Taliban government is going to be a little more liberal, a little more modern, then perhaps the Chinese will come back. But it's tragic that this has happened because China was the only hope for the Afghans, that China will invest in Afghanistan and we will be able to move forward economically. This is not going to happen now. The Chinese are very cautious people. They don't leap into anything they're going to be very, very cautious about entering Afghanistan once again. Pakistan is not in a position economically to do anything without foreign support. So either the Chinese or the Americans or the Russians, somebody plays a role in Afghanistan with Pakistan. But Pakistan can't do it alone. It doesn't have the money, it doesn't have the resources. I don't know if I've answered the question.
No.
Yes. What about, I was mentioning the second one about the external conflict. I mean, is there a need for reconciliation? Is there an opportunity in the future?
Look, the Taliban are very divided at the moment. That's one of the problems. And one of the problems is that they are not able to make a consensus decision. There are Taliban who are in favor of girls' education. There are other Taliban who are saying no girls' education. Now I think this is not sustainable. You're a party in power, you're a government in power. You have to develop a consensus amongst your own people. If your own people are fighting with each other as to what to do, then we have seen that already with this the woman issue. Many Taliban want their girls to be educated, but they are not being allowed by the senior leadership, which is based in Kandahar, and the Kandahari leaders don't meet with anyone. They don't meet with foreign diplomats. They don't meet with NGOs or people who are supplying food or anything like that. And so you have a big problem if you can't meet with your interlocutors. Then obviously there's a big problem.
Thank you. Do you think that equalizing the role of neighbor country of Afghanistan will not let us to reach what's really going on and what will be going on? Because the Pakistani government has a major influence on Taliban. It had before and also it has right now. What you said and mentioned that the main power and center of power of Taliban is in Kandahar, but it seemed to be not in Kandahar. It is in somewhere in Rawalpindi or in Quetta. That's why the world cannot conduct a serious diplomacy with those who are not taking their decision by themselves, and with those the regime that's led and also run by someone in somewhere else, just like what is said and meant during all these years by CIA. And also the solution that you have mentioned about to face in Afghanistan by resisting of civil society. I think this has also a problem. We face a problem here also, that the leading and major who had major role in civil society in Afghanistan, they had been evacuated from Afghanistan by the Western countries. They have been given internationally shelters. Although the thousands of madrasas in Pakistan are still producing many extremists who will be in Afghanistan in future years, this will not work to resist Taliban by civil society by having these facts in front of us. Thank you.
This is look. I think that the taste that the Afghans have had of civil society is not going to disappear. It might go underground. Already you're hearing about girls' education being done in homeschooling, meaning they are schooling the girls at home because the Taliban don't allow them to go to school and college. So there are already anti-government activities that are going on, I think, which are building up, which continue to build up civil society. and girls who want to play football or want to do sports are doing it secretly, and that is something that never happened before, and I think it's something that is new and that is very interesting. And of course you've seen the girls demonstrating in the street, girls wanting their jobs back, or girls wanting education. So, I think what we are seeing is a very definite change from the past activities. When the Taliban came to power in '96, there was military activity against them by all the warlords, and the warlords were defeated, basically. But this time round, I think there has to be a much more mixed and clever solution to the future, and that has to be to mobilize the public. And there is now a large educated public in Kabul and the other big cities. Before, if you knew Afghanistan in the early 60s or 70s, Kabul was the only city in the country. The others were literally villages, and that's not the case now.
Anyone more wants to put a question, or
maybe one last question?
One, two. There are this one and you, and not more, please. Then after we have to sign the book. And I have a last question.
First of all, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. Just before, two things.
¿Puedes hablar un poquitín más, a bit louder, please?
¿Cómo?
Que no se oye bien aquí, que un poco más
vale.
alto.
You said before that the American government influence on Afghanistan, it was difficult to settle a political arrangement there due somewhat of the change of government in the USA. So it unstabilized the situation. And you also said that the Afghans were also Pacific people from the beginning. So my question is, who's at fault here? Not who's at fault, but was it possible to change the final situation that we've had with the Taliban? Or was this situation going to be provoked or prolonged in time? So, yeah, that's the question.
I think he was asking if the situation can change if
the situation will continue like this for a long time? Or
Yeah, I think it will, because there's no foreign intervention being organized. No foreign country wants to intervene at the moment. The world is in such turmoil. There's a wheat crisis, there's a nuclear crisis, there's Ukraine. I don't see anybody wanting to get involved. And the big threat, of course, is that the humanitarian crisis will get worse. And the Taliban will not be able to deal with it. They don't know how to deal with it. And many Afghans will just starve and try and escape, become refugees outside Afghanistan. But all the countries around Afghanistan are blocking these refugees. So we have a very big crisis. And I think it's very important that in Europe at least there should be, and in America, there should be greater awareness of what the Afghans are suffering. Ukraine should not occupy all the oxygen in the room. Some of the oxygen in the room should be given to Afghanistan.
Let's hope.
I think I know the answer. Is there any path forward to negotiations with internal and external actors to move the situation, or is there something internally have to change pretty dramatically before there can be any sort of negotiations for change?
Well, I think, as I said, the government of the Taliban at present is not sustainable for a long period of time. They can use brutal tactics, etc., and repression and prevent education and all the rest of it, but it's not going to survive in this format. Either the Taliban change, or they, in my opinion, they will collapse eventually. So whether there is can there be a new leadership in the Taliban? Can there be a coup d'etat like in the Taliban? I think it's possible because the Taliban don't want to lose power, and they have to. The only way they can maintain power is by changing, and I think we will see that.
Okay, acabamos aquí el turno de preguntas. Sorry, we end here the questions. Only one last question, and it will be mine. You have been saying that the Taliban didn't learn the lesson. That the Taliban didn't learn the lesson.
Yeah.
Maybe that the ones who have not learned the lesson are we, and that we are using somehow this as an excuse or a kind of washing our conscience with a bit of cynicism, because we have not done all what we could be done in Afghanistan in these last 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think the Americans had a huge opportunity after the defeat of Al-Qaeda and the defeat of the Taliban in 2001. A huge opportunity to change Afghanistan. And that opportunity was wasted. A great deal of money was wasted. Corruption came in. Everybody started making money rather than rebuilding the country. And so that was, a huge lost opportunity, which the Afghans are guilty of for not doing the right thing, but also the international community is guilty of for not doing the right thing.
Okay, thank you to all of you, and at all to Ahmed Rashid for his efforts of trying to make us understand a bit more Afghanistan and the region. And now the ones who want to have the book signed, no?
Yeah.
You are ready?
Change is inevitable, and the world we are living in today is changing so rapidly, we don't know what's going to happen. Who knows what the state of the Taliban will be in 2 or 3 years' time.
I don't know if this is a positive ending or a negative.
Well,
it's an ending.
It's an ending.
It's an ending. Thank you.